The UFC has a huge problem that it seems that no one's addressing, and this is a problem that affects the fans, the fighters, and the UFC's bottom line potentially. The UFC's biggest problem stems from the UFC's official MMA glove. To help you better understand why the UFC glove is such a big problem in today's UFC, I'm going to take you through a quick history lesson. In the early days of the combat sport known as bare knuckle boxing, there were no weight classes and no time restraints, and these fights tended to last for hours, with the longest match ever being between James Kelly and Jonathan Smith, and it lasted over 6 hours and 15 minutes. The reason these fights lasted so long is because since it was bare knuckle, the odds of you breaking your hands punching full blast was extremely high. So in order for the fighters to avoid breaking their hands, they would punch way softer, thus the fights lasting way longer. And so in 1743, a boxer named Jack Brogton created the modern day boxing glove, simply making it out of leather and filling it with horsehair. The goal of these boxing gloves was actually not just to protect the fighter, but to protect the fighter's hands from breaking, allowing fighters to punch way harder and way longer, also significantly reducing the likelihood of the fighter injuring their hand. And in 1867, with the introduction of the Marquess of Queensberry rules, boxing gloves became mandatory for all boxers to wear. Now let's fast all the way forward to UFC 1. UFC 1 was bare knuckle, only allowing certain fighters to wrap part of their foot and their wrists. And then there was also this random boxer who only had one boxing glove, who didn't even throw a punch and just got choked out in like 10 seconds. UFC 1 was a wild time, not gonna lie. But the UFC eventually ended up implementing MMA style gloves at UFC 14. But the first fighter we ever have on record to wear MMA style gloves in the UFC was a fighter named Melton Brown at UFC 4. Now, as I stated earlier, gloves were created to protect the fighter's hands so they can fight longer and punch harder. Because as you can see, there are a lot of bones in the human hands that could potentially break from punching. Human hands are really not meant to punch in the first place, but we just do it anyway. Now the problem is, human feet have a ton of bones in them as well. Anyone who's ever done Muay Thai or Taekwondo can tell you, if you hit the bag wrong or if you kick someone wrong, you can break the bones in your foot just as easily as you can break the bones in your hands. But the problem is, in the UFC, you have no foot protection, just hand protection. So because of that, you have a lot of Taekwondo fighters and karate fighters who usually like to land with their feet, constantly breaking their feet. Which is why the UFC is seeing quite the decline of karate and Taekwondo fighters succeeding at a high level in the UFC. Because they're constantly at risk of literally breaking their feet and having to heal and miss out on potential future fight opportunities.
Your foot okay? Your foot okay?
You know what? I gotta stop right there.
Yo, no, we're doing
I gotta
another
stop
10.
right
We got another 10.
No, I may have a fight coming up, and I may have to go get an x-ray or two. This is not normal.
That clip was of UFC fighter Stephen Wonderboy Thompson injuring his foot from kicking someone in the back of the thigh. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson is a high-level black belt in Kempo karate. And if someone with his level of technique and experience can break their foot on someone, it could happen to anybody. Now remember what I showed you before. In UFC 1, in the early days of UFC, it was bare knuckle and barefoot. But in today's UFC, it's only barefoot but protected knuckle, thus giving a pretty huge advantage to people who like to box, or people who can't box at all but just hit super hard. If the UFC was bare knuckle, I don't even think Francis Ngannou would be able to become a UFC champion. Because the super wild, powerful punches that he usually likes to throw in MMA gloves would completely shatter his hands if you weren't wearing gloves. And depending on how many bones you break in your hands, you're probably gonna need surgery, and it'll probably take months to heal. Which is why I wholeheartedly believe the UFC should implement foot protection as well for the fighters. This will allow fighters who like to kick, specifically karate and taekwondo fighters, to have a way better chance at beating boxers and other forms of combat. Adding hand and foot protection will make injuries way less likely, and it'll also make knockouts from kicks way more common. So that would literally mean more money, more knockouts, and less injuries. I don't know if Dana White's ever actually going to see this video, but I hope he does, and I hope he takes this into account, because this will be better for literally everybody, especially the fighters who like to kick. And it would make the UFC way more entertaining and an overall better product because it allows way more diversity in techniques.